here and get started. So welcome to all of you. I want to just tell you again for the folks who are just coming in that we will be recording tonight's webinar. So thanks for being here. Good evening. Welcome to Get the Scoop, New Energy Funds for Congregations. I'm Ann Cooper from the Facilities Working Group of Faith Communities Go Green, and I will be moderating tonight along with my co-chair, Ken Wright, who's busy running the technical side of things, and we'll be tracking some questions in the chat. Faith Communities Go Green is a collaboration between Green Umbrella and Equation. We believe that faith communities have a powerful voice to offer as the world confronts the climate crisis. Our mission is to partner with religious communities to create a more sustainable and equitable future for all by mobilizing their moral voice to reduce the risk of catastrophic climate change. For tonight's webinar, we are really excited to welcome Daniel Bresette, who is the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute in Washington, D.C. Before he joined EESI, Daniel served as the vice president of policy at the Alliance to Save Energy and was also the Maryland Energy Administration's senior energy policy manager. He has degrees in governmental and international relations and business administration. The Environmental and Energy Study Institute, EESI, is a nonprofit that was founded in 1984 by a bipartisan group of members of Congress. And I know that Daniel's going to tell you a little more about their work and mission in just a minute. But what I wanted to mention about this is that the folks at EESI specialize in taking complicated scientific and policy topics and translating them into meaningful, relatable, and actionable information for policymakers and for members of the public like all of us. So tonight, Dan is going to walk us through some funding opportunities for nonprofits, including religious institutions, that can help us fund our energy efficiency projects. He's going to also tell us how we can prepare our institutions to apply for this type of funding. Daniel's presentation will be the first portion of tonight's program, and then we will open the floor for questions, and I'm sure you will have many. And so if you have questions that come up during the presentation, we'd ask that you type those into the chat, and Ken's going to keep track of those, and we'll raise those questions once Dan's finished presenting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Daniel Bresette to talk about new energy funds for congregations. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Ann. It's nice to see you. And thanks to Ken as well for, and everybody for welcoming me. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everyone says it's loading. Hopefully everyone can see that kind of first slide. I'll look for a thumbs up. I see a nod. Okay, that's good enough. So that's right, exactly. We're talk a little bit about some opportunities for energy efficiency, specifically for organizations like yours in the nonprofit sector. And Ann gave a very nice introduction to me and to EESI. I'll be happy to make all of these slides available to everybody. I think actually Ann already has a copy, so we'll be sure to make sure that everyone gets these. We are sort of primarily focused on policymaker education here in Washington, and Congress is our main audience. We also, over time, have developed some expertise around some Department of Agriculture programs for utilities in rural areas. And so combination of us sort of, really paying attention to what Congress is doing or trying to do and what the agencies are trying to do, and then also having this sort of nationwide network that has taught us a lot about energy efficiency and electrification and other technologies. So kind of a fun opportunity to get to know this program that we'll talk about in a minute, as well as other programs that are about to be launched by DOE and eventually by states. Our mission is listed here in purple at the bottom, and so is our vision. And I just wanted to say sort of right at the outset that we consider diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice as core values at EESI. So sort of just starting off, EESI is a climate advocate, but we love energy efficiency. And so right from the outset, a theme of what we'll talk about tonight is just all of the ways that energy efficiency is always a good thing. And it really is. I'm not being facetious with that. Energy efficiency, it delivers multiple benefits to pretty much everyone who's involved in it. And as someone who runs a nonprofit, I know that we're always looking for ways to save money, to reinvest money that can be better used to advance the mission. And that's really what energy efficiency is about. It's about saving wasted energy, and that's saving wasted money. And it's much, much better to devote that to doing what we want to do and serving the communities we serve than it is about, paying for kilowatt hours and for therms that we don't actually ever use. It also is a great first step at enhancing the sustainability and productivity of our facilities and of our operations. You've probably been reading in the news about gas stoves, and it's true, energy efficiency is a great way to improve indoor air quality, especially where you're switching out fossil fuel fired equipment to electric equipment in the kitchen and throughout the house. As a nonprofit, I think we think a lot about our place in our community, and energy efficiency contributes to community health and wellness, as well as resilience. And it's a great way for us and for other organizations to set an example, to really put our money where our mouth is and really try to do right by climate. Energy efficiency is not the only set of improvements that an organization can undertake, but it's often the best place to start. An energy efficient a facility or a building or set of buildings is really much better prepared to accommodate a solar panel or battery storage or even an electric vehicle charger. And so energy efficiency has a way to kind of fit in with other good clean energy investments that we would all like to make. And as a climate advocate, it's the fastest, cheapest, quickest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a lot easier to avoid using energy in the first place than it is to sort of overhaul the grid and transition everything to renewable energy or clean energy quickly, when you can just save money and reduce energy from the start. So specifically what we're here today to talk a little bit about is a little tiny program that was enacted by Congress on a bipartisan basis in November 2021. You've all heard of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and its official name is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. Buried inside this bill, $1.2 trillion bill, $550 billion in new spending, is a $50 million grant program for the Department of Energy to make energy efficiency grants to nonprofits. The bill originally came out of, or the provision actually originally came out of a bill that was introduced in Congress multiple years on a bipartisan basis. And the original authors of the provision had churches and other faith organizations in mind when they crafted the original bill. It's open to all nonprofits, but really that was the sector or subsector that they were really looking for target. So we are sort of in this sort of spot right now where we know what the law says, we know what the agency is looking at because the law tells it to, but we're not quite there yet in terms of having applications become available. And so what we've been doing at EESI has been tracking this very closely and working very closely with people on Capitol Hill, but also with the agencies to really help organizations prepare for the opportunity. And so that concept of preparedness is really a major theme of what we'll soon be talking about. The statute itself is very limited. I mean, it's like 1 page long, and the bill, I'm sure, is this thick. And so there are some things that we know, but there are also some things that we don't know. And so starting with the things that we know that the grant maximum is $200,000. So $50 million divided by 200,000 isn't a whole lot, but we know that that's the statutory maximum that DOE can make grants. $200,000 is a pretty big grant for a lot of nonprofits around the country. But that's sort of one of the pieces of information the statute gives us. We also know what a nonprofit building means. So in this case, it's specifically defined as a building that's owned and operated by an organization that has 501c3 status. We know what an energy efficiency material is, and that is a product, a piece of equipment, or a system that results in the reduction of energy or fuel consumption. And then it lists a bunch of examples, a non-exclusive list of examples of what we count. So roofs, lighting systems, doors, insulations, things like that. And then the wiring and installation of sort of accessories that you would have to have sort of on site to make them work. And we know what DOE will ultimately be looking for when they start collecting applications for nonprofits. We know what the 4 performance-based criteria will be. The first is energy savings achieved, so that makes sense. Cost effectiveness of the use of energy efficiency materials, that sort of gets to the idea of leverage that we'll talk about later. A plan for evaluation, measurement, and verification of energy savings. This is really important for the Department of Energy to want to be able to communicate to Congress and to the public about the benefits that this provision has delivered. And that's also something that can be a little complicated, and one reason why that idea of preparedness is so important. And then finally is financial needs. So the organizational finances. And so they're looking to target organizations that really would be able to put those saved dollars to good use. What do we not know? So this is where the list starts to get a little long. A lot of these are really important things that would be really nice to know, but we're a little ways away from that. So the first thing we don't know is what the minimum grant amount would be. We know that they can't make a grant more than $200,000, but how small would they go? We don't know that yet. We also don't know if those 4 criteria will be weighted at all. Will there be some of them that DOE determines is more important or less important when collecting applications and making award decisions? We don't know what that would be. We also don't know exactly how involved the application process will be. Most nonprofits that this program will be looking at or targeting have never applied for a DOE grant before. It can be a lot of paperwork, and so it's going to be really important to track how involved that application process will be. And then ultimately, we don't know how many applications there will be. There are a lot of nonprofits in the United States. There are a lot of faith-based organizations in the United States. But then when you add animal shelters and hospitals and schools and libraries, it's a lot of organizations, and $50 million simply won't be enough. And we don't know exactly how inundated DOE will be with applications. And then the timing. So there's 2 things that we don't know about the timing. One is we don't know when the grants will be awarded, although I think it's reasonable to expect that there will take some time once the applications are due. And we don't know when the grants will be dispersed. And that's obviously critically important for a nonprofit that may be watching cash flow, is the timing of all of that. So a couple things have been happening with the program lately. The first, and over time we'll get more clues about what this will actually look like. The first is back in December, DOE collected a bunch of information from organizations like EESI to get input on a whole bunch of questions about how the program should be structured. So that was due, I think, December 22nd. So they've had it for a couple months now. We submitted some pretty extensive comments, sort of going through all of the different things that we have been talking about with nonprofits to help them understand the best way that they could develop a program. And last week, actually, we had a congressional briefing. EESI hosted a congressional briefing, and Dr. Henry McCoy, who's the director of the office at DOE that administers the program, mentioned in the briefing and put in slides sort of some specific timing. So we know that there'll be something called a notice of intent, which is kind of like a warning shot. We know that'll come out next month. We don't know when, but next month. And then something called a funding opportunity announcement, or a FOA. And that's the actual sort of set of instructions for applying for the grant. That will come out in May. If you think, okay, well, May, they're going to need to give nonprofits a little bit of time to apply. And then they're going to have to make awards, and then they're going to have to get we're probably looking at nothing, no dollars flowing before the end of the year, just especially if they get a lot of volume. But that's really important to know and to start thinking about. And we'll see whether or not DOE is able to give some time estimates when that notice of intent and FOA comes out. So you're saying, well, why did Ann and Ken bring us to this webinar today if we're talking about a grant program that's still months away, and we're not going to get dollars, maybe even by the end of the year? And that gets back to the idea of preparedness. So while you can apply, while you're not going to get the grant anytime soon, and even we're not even sure how many applications DOE will have to consider, there are some things that organizations can do now so that when the opportunity presents itself, you'll be ready to go. Because we don't know exactly how long the application window will be either. And while energy efficiency is always a good thing, sometimes it takes a little bit of forethought in order to put an optimal project together. And remember, those 4 criteria, energy savings and cost effectiveness, are 1 and 2 on the list. And those kinds of projects take a little bit of time to develop. So what we've done here at EESI is we've come up with some suggestions for organizations to start thinking about and even start doing now, so that when that funding opportunity announcement is available in April, you'll all be ready to go. And, we don't know if every organization that applies will get a grant, probably not. But these are actually really great steps generally, because a lot of energy efficiency projects are cost effective even without external funding, even without grant dollars, because of the ability to generate cash flow from savings. So the first suggestion that we have to offer is learning about how energy is consumed in your buildings. This can just be a walkthrough. How old is the furnace? How old is the boiler? How many lights are there? How many exit signs are there? If you have a facility that has cooking equipment, what's the age of it? What's the fuel source? What's the model number? What's the make? All of that is actually really important to get a baseline of how energy is consumed in your buildings. And that information will be useful as we go through some of these additional suggestions. And the first way that will be useful is when you're benchmarking. So we know that they're going to care about evaluation, measurement, and verification. We know they're going to care about savings, and we know they're going to care about cost effectiveness. Those are things that are really difficult to demonstrate unless your building has been benchmarked. And all that means is establishing a baseline of energy consumption. It's usually something that you do with 12 months of utility bills. You may not have 12 months of utility bills running, laying around. You may have to go find them. You may have to call the utility and get them issued, or maybe go on the website and access your account. But that's really the first place that it starts. We've been working very closely with our friends at Energy Star, and they have tremendous resources for congregations. And one of their tools is called Portfolio Manager, and it's an online tool. It's free. It's the industry standard. It's actually the gold standard for this kind of tool, but it does require some information to be entered. But once you're in Portfolio Manager, it's amazing how much consumption you can actually track. The next thing that we suggest is to start thinking about what a successful project looks like. So, does your organization already have energy efficiency goals? Do you have climate goals? Do you understand how energy efficiency can contribute to those climate goals? How will you measure? How will you report savings over time? All of these sort of elements of the plan are really important to start thinking about. And then who's going to be involved? Are the people on this webinar the people who will ultimately have the decision to go or no go? Do you have a CFO? Do you have a board? Do you have trustees? Do you have people that you have to appeal to get permission to do the project? That stuff is really useful to start thinking about now, so that you're not making phone calls the day before an application is due or the hour before the end of the day saying, hey, by the way, can I do this project? And developing that support, again, it's going to be really helpful down the road. This is also a great opportunity to start thinking about additional funds to leverage. Some of these funds might be internal. You might have a capital budget. You might have funds from donors in your area. You also may have external dollars. You may have utility programs, financial or non-financial. There may be other grant opportunities that are offered by your state or your city or your local government. It's a good time to start thinking about sort of what those are, because there will probably be some amount of cost match. DOE won't fund an entire 100% of the project. There'll have to be sources from other places. We've recommended that they make that as small as possible, but even then, you still want to leverage as many other resources as possible. Also, a good time to start thinking about financing, if that's going to be an option. This is a good time to find an auditor. There may be people in your community, whether they're contractors or professional auditors, who can help you sort of assemble a really, really cost-effective project. You may be able to do that yourselves. You might have perhaps engineers in your congregation that can help with all of this, but a lot of programs require somebody to really kind of oversee how all the moving parts fit together. And then this last one is something where EESI can help. And this is about learning about how other nonprofits have tackled this challenge. So there's a link here to our website, and I have some links a little bit later in the presentation as well. My colleague Miguel, who's not with us because he has a sick kid tonight, has been doing a lot of case studies. He's been doing a lot of writing specifically about how churches and other faith-based organizations have undertaken energy efficiency projects, and then how they've also leveraged energy efficiency into other clean energy projects. And so I have links for all of those. And they're really good reads. A lot of organizations have undertaken this, and they all kind of have to go through the same thing. And it's a good opportunity to learn from others. And, Faith Communities Go Green as sort of a network of organizations that are like-minded. My guess is that even if your church or your congregation hasn't thought about this, somebody else has, and they might have some really, really good tips that are specifically applicable to your situation. So before we wrap up, kind of want to revisit this idea of leverage. So when talking about energy efficiency, we're really talking about leverage. Energy efficiency saves money that can be invested and used for other purposes. And that's really what makes it so great. And for anyone who grew up in the 80s, that's the secret word. I'm not going to do the scream and my chair doesn't talk, but you'll forgive me for that. So we talked a little bit about where other resources can come from and, really putting together sort of that comprehensive project. One of the reasons why leverage is so important is because a little bit of energy efficiency is good, more energy efficiency is better, but a lot of energy efficiency is really the way to go because of the way that a lot of systems and equipment and appliances work with each other. So, for example, if you're making improvements to your lighting, if you're switching out old fluorescent bulbs, old incandescents, that will have an effect on your heating load. That will make your air conditioner or your heat pump work less. If you are switching out old gas cooking equipment and things like that, that'll have an impact on your mechanical ventilation systems. And so all of this stuff typically goes together, and the more you're able to assemble, the more you'll be able to kind of take advantage of the system's effective energy efficiency. And so as we're thinking about how to put all of this together, there may be things that you have at your availability already that you can sort of deploy to do this. And we have to all be honest, maybe not everybody gets a grant. And so as you're thinking about all of these resources to put together, what we've tried to do is identify things that don't rely on the grant. And the first is cash and reserves. A lot of nonprofits, but not all, have some. But with a little bit of forethought and some planning, you might be able to set some aside, and you'd be surprised by how far a little bit can go. Energy Star is another really great resource, a lot of information, but also Portfolio Manager, that really powerful benchmarking tool. Also, if you're thinking about appliances and anything that's consumer facing, Energy Star is a tremendous resource to make sure that you're getting the most efficient model, whether it's a television or a computer monitor or a microwave or things like that. It's really, really an impressive resource. I mentioned utility rebates. A lot of utilities have financial incentives to do, especially things around like LED lighting or exit signs, things that you might not think of as generating a lot of savings, but you might be surprised by how many exit signs you have in your building because you have to have them. And there's actually they can become LED and they can use practically no energy at all. Other utility programs might not be financial. They might have haul-away programs. They might have recycling programs. They might have other information programs. They might have networks that might help you find a contractor or an auditor. And so utility is usually a really good, if you're going to start by making phone calls, utility really ought to be one of the first ones. And they probably have someone who specializes in nonprofits. We'll talk a little bit about this in a coming slide, but there are some really impressive tax incentives. Why are we talking about tax incentives? We're tax exempt, yes, but the Inflation Reduction Act that passed last year provides something called direct pay. And so tax exempt organizations now have access to tax incentives that tax paying organizations and entities previously had, and they're pretty generous. So there's an enormous opportunity, especially for things like solar and battery storage and things like that. Grants, we've talked about this grant, but maybe there are other grants. Maybe there are state grants, local grants that are available that you might want to look for. There may be other sources of philanthropic dollars that are interested in making investments in communities as well. Financing, I mentioned that. Ohio doesn't have a statewide green bank, but there are potentially some third-party financing availability in your area, and that's something to start taking a look at. And then qualified contractors. You're not going to be able to do a lot of what we're talking about without qualified contractors. And so starting to think about their expertise and how you can leverage that into coming up with a compelling project is really important. And again, here is a link. And again, we'll make sure that Anne gets these slides so that everybody has them. But this link will take you to our article series that goes into all of these topics in a lot more detail that my colleague Miguel has been writing for the last couple months. So up to now, we've talked primarily about energy efficiency, but Anne wanted to make sure we also talked about a few other things that are coming down the pike for nonprofits, because yes, energy efficiency is good, but there's other good stuff too. So the first is this idea of direct pay. Previously, before the Inflation Reduction Act, you had to have a tax liability. You had to be a tax-paying entity to take advantage of the solar, the 30% solar tax incentive or tax credit that also applies to things like geothermal heat pumps and battery storage. Now you don't have to. You can access those resources using something called direct pay. Now, this is where we get into the unknowns, because the Treasury Department hasn't actually issued the guidance for how to do this, but it's something that everybody really should be aware of. And my prediction is that soon after the guidance is issued by the Treasury Department, a lot of people become experts in how to use this. And so accountants, tax lawyers, organizations that work with nonprofits, service providers, they're all going to become really good at helping nonprofits fill out all of the paperwork, because it's the IRS. Of course, there's paperwork in order to get these incentives, but it's a good thing to start thinking about now. Also, recognizing the fact that congregations and churches and faith-based organizations are leaders in their communities, you all have people that you will come in contact with. And I wanted to also add a couple slides that are available to residents. So people who are in your congregations themselves, in case they come to you as green leaders and say, hey, have you heard about this thing? So the first is something called the Energy Efficient Home Improvement Credit. Now, this is something that's been around for a while, but the Inflation Reduction Act that passed last year massively enhanced it. We're talking about annual caps of up to $2,000 for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. Annual is the operative word. You can go back and get this tax credit multiple years. That's something that people have never been able to do before. And also for building envelope and other improvements. So if you're making insulation improvements, or if you're insulating crawl spaces, or you're air sealing, or your duct sealing, you can put together some really, really robust projects thanks to these new extended tax incentives. Again, we're only talking about residences here, and there's some rules about what type of residents apply. But generally, if you have a house, these are the kinds of things that are available to you. There are also brand new grant programs, or rebate programs. The first is called the Home Electrification Rebate Program, and the second is called the Homeowner Managing Energy Savings, or HOMES Rebate Program. These dollars will actually not be flow directly from the Department of Energy. They'll actually go to your state energy office, and then the state energy office will figure out how to implement it in a way that makes sense for Ohio. But there is almost $9 billion coming down the pike to help people improve the energy efficiency of their home. The electrification rebate program has income requirements attached to it, but the HOMES doesn't. And HOMES also is very flexible in terms of whether you're measuring savings or estimating savings. And there's a lot of work to be done about how these programs will actually roll out. But $9 billion is quite a bit of money. And all of the states are super, super interested in getting it ASAP, probably a little bit later this year, and then figuring out how to put programs out. So keep an eye out for that. And then the last thing I'll mention is the electric vehicle tax credit. Again, something that's been around for a while, but majorly expanded in the Inflation Reduction Act. Not only can you get $7,500 for a new car, you can also get $4,000 for a used electric car, which is really cool and something that wasn't possible before. Again, something that's available to consumers or homeowners as opposed to nonprofits, but still a good thing, I think, for people to be aware of. So these are those resources I promised you. If you click on any of these links, they'll take you to the website. You can read all about the sort of the basics of energy efficiency for nonprofits. Some of the case studies here. Miguel wrote a really great article a couple of weeks ago about a Connecticut theater that did an energy efficiency project. We've also done the second one from the bottom is about a seminary in Indiana that made investments in geothermal and energy efficiency to great benefit, and really interesting stuff. Also some links to some DOE resources. And if you want to learn more, that last link at the bottom of the slide here is just, it brings you to an article that my colleague John Michael wrote last year that kind of goes into some of the other incentives that we've talked about in a little bit more detail if you want to learn more. So I think that wraps me up. And so thank you, Anne and Ken, for the invitation, and thanks for everybody for joining us. And I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Dan. I am going to ask Ken to see if there are any questions in the chat that we can say.
Yeah, we have a couple here. First one is, not all churches are 501c3. Would they be covered if they're not? You're muted.
Sorry, I'm looking for my mute button. So I suppose the Department of Energy will address this, but I think the statute's pretty clear. They're really looking for organizations that have 501c3 status. I'm not sure how much flexibility DOE will have to go beyond that, but that's written into the statute. It's one of the sort of the core definitions that's actually in the statute. The other thing is you have to own your facility. So EESI can't get a grant. We have 501c3 status. But we don't own we lease space. So we're also kind of left out. My guess is that they did that purposefully so that there aren't issues with split incentive and having to get landlord permissions and dealing with leases and covenants and things like that. But yeah, you have to be a 501c3 as we understand it, and as the statute I think pretty clearly says, and you also have to own your facility.
Okay, next question. Do you have any information on IRA subsidies for local content and installing a prevailing wage rate for solar panels?
So generally, this will definitely be something that DOE addresses in the guidance. If in general, especially if it came from the Inflation Reduction Act, those things are written in. As a rule of thumb, those sorts of things apply when you're dealing with non-residential projects. So for the homes rebate and the electrification rebate, my guess is that they will they'll have some amount of exemption to those, but for pretty much everything else, my expectation is that they will do their best to ensure that those apply. And that has impact, but that was especially like I said, coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, that was a top priority of the bill. But my guess is the DOE will specifically answer that question when they issue their guidance. I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Okay, there was a question about how do we get your slides? I think Ann's going to take care of that, right, Ann?
Yes, yeah, I already have the slides from Dan, and I believe we should have the email addresses for everyone who registered for this event, so we will send those out after the fact. And Dan, you also mentioned that you'll be sending out updates as well to the groups that you've done this presentation for. So when some of this additional information comes out from the DOE, we will be able to pass that on to everyone who was on this webinar.
And the other thing I can share too is I can share, if anyone wants some light reading, I can share the response that we submitted to DOE back in December. It's 10 pages, but it goes over a lot of the different issues. And if you're interested in sort of all of the different things the agency has to figure out, I can share a link to that as well. You don't have, no one has to read it, of course, but if you're interested, it's there. And it took a lot of time to put together. But yeah, we'll definitely do that. And actually, Anne, I think I can send you an updated slides a little bit later or first thing tomorrow morning, because I think I have like drafts. I think I have the word draft and stuff like that, so I can fix that for you.
Perfect.
Okay, now you mentioned the $50 million for the country is pennies, compared to the total need. So what can we do to encourage Congress to increase the amount?
Well, so we, one of the things that we heard directly from the Department of Energy over the last several months is they're very aware of the words pilot program. So they're really, really hyper-focused on making this program a big success because the amount of interest in it has really been off the charts. And so there's a lot of interest in the Department of Energy itself, and I think on Capitol Hill, to make this a permanent program and to increase increase appropriations for, or provide appropriations for it. The Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act actually started as the Surface Transportation Bill. And so not only did it authorize the program, it also funded the program. But that only comes up every certain number of years. And so we'll have to figure out sort of what a legislative strategy is to kind of get more money. EESI does not do grassroots lobbying. So we can't tell anybody to go tell their member of Congress to go vote for this or that. But it's definitely something that's on people's minds. And I think as we go along a little bit more, I think DOE will need a little bit of time to let the program run its course. And then I anticipate that there will be a push. It might be included in the budget one year. It might be included because of the members who originally proposed this are still serving in Congress, so they're still around and they're bipartisan. So I think over time there will absolutely be a push to provide more money for the program. And DOE is really focused on this first $50 million to make the most of it, to sort of as a proof point.
Why don't you unshare your screen, we can see everybody, and then we can probably could open up the floor to questions more generally. I have one since I got the mic here. You know, Faith Communities Go Green is kind of an umbrella organization or consortium. You know, we don't own property, but we work with, you know, congregations that do. So do you think there's any strategic value for a group like us putting in a proposal as opposed to helping individual congregations do that?
Well, I mean, I think to the extent that Faith Communities Go Green is a 501c3 and owns its facility, it would be eligible. But if it doesn't meet those criteria, it probably wouldn't be eligible. I don't want to encourage or discourage anyone from making an application. DOE will provide a lot of really important information that will impact that decision when the notice of intent and the funding opportunity announcement comes out. But I think there's a tremendous value in convening sessions like this, where people can ask questions, we can sort of share updates, like Ann said. As we learn more, we will put more resources out that hopefully will be useful and informative to organizations deciding what to do. My guess is that not every organization under the umbrella will decide it's really worth it to make an application. We don't know how involved it will be, but you know, not every organization has the capacity to put something like this together. But I mentioned that because another potential thing that an umbrella group could do is publicize the successes of successful applicants, you know, in its umbrella, or the other kinds of case studies that might pop up, you know, from maybe in other nonprofit sectors around Ohio or in other parts of the country. You know, we've done about 12 of these webinars, and we've reached about 2,100 people with organizations around the country. That's a lot, probably well more than DOE could possibly fund, but we're trying to really establish that network, because even though we can't, kind of to your point, we want to be able to tell the story of organizations that have done well and experienced it. And, you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm because there's a grant opportunity coming down the pike. But, you know, I'll say it again, this stuff is cost effective. And it may make sense, especially if you're also thinking about a solar installation or battery storage, or if your furnace is about to die, or you need new cooking equipment or something like that. You know, a lot of what we've talked about tonight is applicable even in the absence of a grant. And a lot of this stuff can deliver savings even without that. But you know, I think it's really important for groups to be able to come together, share insights, provide that extra capacity and support, even if ultimately an application isn't, you know, the right fit.
Yeah.
Joanne, you had a question?
Oh,
No, you need to unmute yourself.
Thanks. Okay, so a number of things. First of all, Faith Communities Go Green has put a lot of time into researching grants, and they're not just all local grants, but you can find an awful lot of this information on our website. If you go to the toolkit page, you'll see 6 boxes, and one of them is labeled grants. And on that page is a link to an Excel sheet, and there's about 30 different grant foundations that focus on houses of worship and environmental sustainability. So that's worth looking at if you're serious about this. I know my question is about qualified contractors. You mentioned that, and I'm like, how do you find who's qualified? Who decides who's qualified for what? You know, where are these lists, and how do we trust the list?
Well, it's a great question also for the utility as well. But generally speaking, there are professional societies that provide or trade groups that provide sort of the criteria for a qualified. Sometimes they'll be called certified. In the residential sector, there's something called building performance, and you can be BPA certified and other kinds of certification. But if it's a legit qualification or certification, it's something that you can look up. It's something you can verify. They'll probably have information about what they had to do to get it. But a lot of it is a lot of it will be potentially listed on the utility website. There's probably also a state organization that does it. It does vary, which is why I said qualified as opposed to the specific qualification, because there is some variability. And also, if you're assembling a project and you're just looking for a contractor, that's one level. If you're hiring a professional engineer with the little stamp to actually put the project together, that's a different level. And so it does kind of vary, but generally speaking, there are professional societies and trade organizations that put those out. And I mean, I don't think there's a reason not to believe them. They've generally done some amount of training. They've got some kind of qualification that means that they are sort of entitled to that. And if you have any questions, I'm sure if you ask them, if you get a kind of a dodgy yes, then maybe you'll know that you need to go find somebody else. But I would check with your utility as well.
There's a website, I think it's called Desire, which is spelled a little differently. Maybe
DSIRE. Mm-hmm.
And they have qualifications by state. Will this be the same list that the federal government will acknowledge?
I don't know that they'll specifically acknowledge it, but there are only so many. And so Desire is an excellent resource. I'll put the link to the in the chat, and so it's probably a good place to start.
Okay, Ed, you had a question about timing that. You need to. Yeah,
that was me. Our congregation is imminently in need of replacing our roof on our building. And with this in mind, I want to know if we've already started a project or we've completed a project. Would grants be applicable, or is it something where we might have to wait until we find out more about the grant?
That is something that will probably come up in the notice of intent in the application. I don't know the answer, but my educated guess is that we're talking about retrofits that haven't started yet, as opposed to things that have happened in the past or are currently happening. That's if just knowing DOE, my guess is. Another thing that will hopefully be addressed in the guidance is sort of what's required by code and what's considered above code. And so generally speaking, if you're just complying with code, probably not going to be part of a grant application. They would probably consider, additional things. I tend to think that they use the word roof in the statute. So that's definitely an eligible use. I wonder how many organizations will actually be able to include roofs in compelling applications, just because typically speaking, the way the code has evolved over the years, a lot of the energy efficiency will already be counted for in that. But we'll have to kind of wait and see on that. In a lot of commercial buildings, roof replacement is really the only opportunity to make envelope improvements. And so that's been a key driver of efficiency improvements in the code over the years. But for churches that, have, different structures, a lot of churches might look more like a big house as opposed to, a mid-rise or high-rise commercial building. There are probably some things there that would work just fine. And I think we'll probably have to wait to see. But my educated guess is that they will specifically fund projects that haven't started yet, and that without the grant wouldn't otherwise happen. But we'll see.
Right.
Okay, do we have other questions from the floor?
I have a question. So many congregations are, depending on the goodwill and time of volunteers to do a lot of this work. And so with the Energy Star Portfolio Manager, how big of a time commitment would you say it is for a volunteer to input that information and be responsible for that?
I mean, it's definitely a time commitment. I think if it's someone who is technically savvy, not like IT, but like someone who might have been an architect or an engineer or a mechanic, or someone maybe who worked in the HVAC industry, or maybe, you know, insulated houses or things like that, probably figured out in a pretty quick way, or someone who worked for a utility. I think if you're starting from scratch, there's probably definitely a learning curve. They're pretty clear about what they require. And a lot of it is just getting the information that it needs and then inputting the information. So there's not, you don't have to go out necessarily and like measure things. If you know the square footage of your property, or if you know the irrigation demands of the property, or you know the year it was built, if you know the tonnage of the air conditioners, if you know the make and model of different things, that's the kind of stuff you have to track down. And that's really kind of having someone with some familiarity with how the systems work. But Portfolio Manager is, it's basically the tool for, you know, the most sophisticated commercial buildings in the country, benchmarked all the way down to, you know, organizations with, you know, entirely volunteer staffs. So there's lots of opportunities to, or lots of different types of organizations. One thing that we've spoken with Energy Star specifically with, and I think they've already done this. We also did, we co-sponsored a webinar with Interfaith Power and Light about benchmarking, because it is so critical. And so that I think is available at Energy Star. It may also be available at IPL's sort of national website, but that's something that we've really encouraged Energy Star to be very upfront with, not just because they have the best tool, but also because for a lot of organizations, it's a really essential first step.
Can I weigh on that a little bit? Because I have used Energy Star in the past. And yeah, it takes a little time to do, but it's not onerous, I don't think. And I'd be happy to help people get started on that to the extent that I can. And once you get it up, it's a matter of just keeping the information, you know, month by month or even quarter by quarter, depending on how you want to do it, you know, up to date, so you build up the history. We actually used it when I was at a previous church, and to document our progress over a project where we ended up getting a Energy Star award for a church in Ohio, one of the few. It was kind of really weird because it was not what you would think of as an energy efficiency building, but we had done some things that really fit the system apparently. I must admit that I don't use it now because it's just easier for me just to use a spreadsheet, but it's a good tool. It's like he says, it's the gold standard. And Justin weighed in too. I don't know, you want to say something about that, your experience with it, Justin?
Yeah, I just dropped in the chat. I think with, you know, any type of computer skill, an hour can get things set up. Like you mentioned, Daniel, the, you know, half a dozen characteristics of the church, you know, classification or seating, congregation capacity in the sanctuary, you know, kitchen square footage, so a few basic things to put in there. And then, you know, there has in the past even been programs, and I know we run a consulting firm working with nonprofits where you can, you know, get set up on an automated program to get your utility data directly dumped from your utility when they update the bill every month. It can automatically be dropped into Portfolio Manager, so it can be kind of a, I hate to use the term set it and forget it, but set it and track it rather than spend 15 minutes putting data in, go in and run some reports, or like you said, Ken, track your progress so you can see how those, you know, actions are impacting others. And, you know, I know several congregations use it to generate a monthly report for their board.
Yeah,
I've
found it surprising that so few churches actually do this, and a lot of them don't seem to know what they're spending on utilities a month and how it varies from season to season and all this kind of stuff, which can be very helpful in revealing what you should be doing about it.
It's frankly like a lot of technology. There's way more features than most folks will ever use. But if you get somebody that can kind of unlock the power of it, it can be very visual and helpful to be able to share that message with folks as you're petitioning for future donations. You're making a pitch for a grant or things of that sort, to be able to tell the data and the digital story.
Sense. Joanne, did you have another question there?
Well, I have two, because this led me to another question. So I'm going to follow up with what Justin and Ken were saying. And that is about, it's easy for some people to set this up and not so easy for others, as what has been mentioned, that a lot of volunteers are the ones who do the footwork. So then my question would be, Justin and Ken, would you be willing to help people? Or is there a way to get help in setting that Energy Star program up for a congregation?
Well, there are, I think, tutorials up on the web too that they have on the energy, the portfolio manager website. So that's one option to do. But I guess I have, with qualifications, I would be willing to help. I don't have infinite resources or time, so it kind of going to depend on how extensive it turns out to be. But I'm certainly willing to talk to people to help get them started. Like I said, I haven't used it for a bit, so I'd have to refresh myself, but I'm willing to do that and willing to give it a try.
Well, thank you. I really put you on the spot, Ken. So
Sure, it'll cost you.
no doubt.
I like Ken, so I'll be willing to share and shoulder some of the load, Ken.
Thank you, Justin.
Super. So my other question is directed to Daniel. And so I want to be clear, and I'm not clear. The IRA, the act or law will give direct funding bypassing the tax incentive rebate. So the funding is direct. I did not hear you mention that opportunity for grants from the $50 million currently for the infrastructure law that Biden signed into law. Is there direct funding for nonprofits bypassing the tax incentives rebate and for energy efficiency projects?
No, not in the same way as the grant program. So the tax incentives that will be subject to the direct pay really focused on renewable energy like solar, battery storage. The exception is geothermal. And a lot of people think about geothermal as a energy efficiency technology because it replaces something that's less efficient. So to the extent that you're undertaking a geothermal system, and geothermal systems can be $30,000, $40,000, they're dependent on the geography and the geology of where you live and the water tables and all of that. But no, generally speaking, the direct pay will be for solar and other renewable energy and storage technologies. The $50 million nonprofits program is specifically energy efficiency. So no renewable energy and no storage. So much like all of this other stuff, it's all kind of coming out here and there. And so it is kind of tricky to keep track of. And ideally an organization, is able to time it so that they do an efficiency project, whether it's grant funded or not. And then when the direct pay incentives become available, I guess probably pretty soon, working on the guidance, be able to sort of install a more efficient or, more cost-effective system. But all of that kind of gets back to the idea of, really sort of stepping back and saying, what are the goals? What does a successful project look like, and who's going to be involved at different stages? But no, they're really two different things. They go together, but they don't really cover the same measure. Also, we'll see this, I think, in the guidance, but also in the notice of intent, is generally speaking, you can't use federal dollars from two different sources to cover the same project. So even if you were getting a grant for an energy efficiency improvement, and even if there were a tax incentive that could apply to it, you probably have to pick one or the other. You can probably, you can what they call stacking them, so that you can use a grant to do project X and then a tax incentive to do project Y. But to the extent that they overlap, that's something that's typically not allowed. And that's where sort of other sources of rebates and grants and things like that on the slide after PWE come in, because those are all probably perfectly fine. You can cost match those, sort of to the maximum extent, but generally speaking, federal dollars probably can't fund the same project.
So, well, thank you. So, but I want to then follow up. About 6 weeks ago, Faith Communities Go Green, this particular working group, facilities working group, hosted a couple speakers, and several people were on that webinar that we did. And I think I recognized some of the names from some of the people that were participating, and maybe they can help us, or can. We have the recording on our website. Maybe you can help us further that process along, because there were some terrific ideas that came out of that, and terrific options.
Well, I would just say that if there are congregations represented here tonight that are seriously considering, submitting for this grant, that they let us know, either through Ann or through Joanne, and we can probably do some sort of follow-up when we have a group of congregations in the area that say they want to pursue this, and at least investigate it anyway. It's not a commitment, and sit down with them and try to help them do this, figure out what they need in order to make it move forward for them. What do you think, Joanne?
Yeah, no, I think that's super. And I'm wondering if on your page on the website, maybe you and I can talk about publishing some of the resources, and maybe some links or email addresses that people can contact. That provided the information for the energy efficiency and solar talk that was a couple weeks ago.
I think that's a great idea, and I really like this idea, Ken, of maybe having kind of a support group for people who are interested in entering this process, so that we can share resources and information. So I see that we're getting close to the end of our time window here. Unless there are any final questions, I want to kind of bring things to a close. And thank you again, Daniel, for sharing your expertise with us. We will make sure to get those slides sent out to all the registrants, and then future resources as well. And I'm going to put my email in the chat too, in case anybody wants to reach out to me. And I want to thank you again for being here and for being involved in this work in your congregations. We appreciate you. And thank you, Daniel, for presenting tonight. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much, Ann. It's nice of you to say, and thanks, Ken, and everybody. And my contact information, we didn't get to the last slide, but my contact information is in the slides as well. So
great. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
And Ken, thanks for doing the honors with the Zoom. I appreciate it.
You'll need to, can you copy the chat notes, because it's got links and so on, and the regular attendees cannot copy it. There should be 3 dots on the right-hand side at the bottom, to it says save chat.
Oh, I see.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
down here.
and it's not on mine, so I'm assuming it's not on anybody else's either.
So where does it get saved to?
It'll save to
My Zoom
your
account?
someplace in your computer, and hopefully you should be able to find it.
Someplace in hyperspace, right?
Yeah, it usually for some reason turns up, so I don't know how to answer that.
Okay, well, I have done that, and I also just copied and pasted into a file. So one way or the other, we'll get it.
Thank you. Good job, both of you, on both programs. Terrific.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really informative. I got ideas turning.
Yep. Yeah, very informative. Thank you.
Well, take care.
You
Talk to you
too.
all.
Okay, bye-bye.
So long. You guys still on, Paul and Michael?